Excuse me, I think your sensor might have shifted. Just here.
Why will it have a sensor?
The notification appeared at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and Choi Jae-won would later mark it as the precise moment his entire algorithmic framework for understanding human beings began its catastrophic, irreversible collapse. He was standing in the lobby of the Gangnam Tower building where his fund operated, waiting for the elevator after 16 hours of watching currency pairs move against each other like enemies in slow motion, when his smart ring buzzed with an unusual reading. His biometrics were his religion: resting heart rate, HRV, cortisol proxy, sleep debt accumulated down to the decimal. He checked his ring the way other men checked their reflections, constantly and with great confidence in what they would find. Tonight, the ring was showing an anomalous reading he had never seen before, and it was coming from the woman standing 2 feet to his left. He should clarify, the ring was showing his own anomalous reading, but his engineer's brain immediately sought an external cause, and his eyes moved to her without his full permission, and stayed there without his permission either. She was tall and luminous in a way that seemed to generate its own ambient light, the kind of beautiful that made surrounding spaces look better just by association. She wore a silk blouse tucked into wide-legged trousers, natural hair gathered into a loose updo that had given up on formalities somewhere around hour 10 of whatever her day had been. She was looking at her phone with the expression of a woman who had received news she was still deciding how to feel about. He noticed at the hem of her blouse a faint line of texture, something looped and intentional beneath the fabric. His ring-calibrated brain processed it as a sensor band that had ridden up, maybe a continuous glucose monitor that had shifted, some piece of health technology sitting incorrectly against her skin, and possibly causing the very interference he was measuring in his own biometrics. He was, he would reflect later, an incredibly specific kind of fool. "Excuse me," he said in English, because she didn't look like someone who needed him to assume her language. "I think your sensor might have shifted. Just here." And he gestured, professionally, clinically, the way one data-literate professional alerts another to a technical malfunction. She turned and looked at him with eyes so dark and direct they could have calibrated a satellite. Then she looked down at his hand, which had apparently decided to lightly touch the fabric near her waist to indicate the area of concern, a decision his brain had not fully authorized, and then she looked back up at him with an expression he had never encountered in any trading room, any client meeting, any of the precisely organized social encounters that comprised his entire adult life. "That," she said, and her accent carried warmth and something that sounded like educated amusement, "is not a fitness tracker." The elevator arrived. She stepped inside. He stood in the lobby for 3 full seconds before following, which his ring registered as a dip in heart rate variability that would concern him for the next 2 weeks. Her name was Adaze. She told him this in the elevator, apparently deciding to take pity on him, and she worked on the 23rd floor as a cultural liaison for an international development consultancy. The beads front her waist were Igbo waist beads, hand-strung by her grandmother in Enugu before Adaze had left for Seoul 18 months ago. Each strand carried a specific meaning, some for protection, some for womanhood, some for a prayer her grandmother had pressed into the glass and cord with her own hands. Jae-won stood in an elevator listening to this information and felt something entirely new happen inside his chest, something his ring dutifully logged as an elevated resting rate with no identifiable physiological cause. He apologized 3 times in the elevator. She accepted once and told him the other 2 were excessive. He found this more interesting than he was prepared for. He was 31 years old, orange-haired since a bet with his trading desk partner the previous spring, 6 feet of disciplined muscle that his 5 a.m. workout schedule had constructed with the same methodical intensity he applied to everything else. He had been told he was handsome often enough that it had become ambient data, a variable he acknowledged without waiting. What he had never been was genuinely unsettled by another person. Every relationship in his adult life had proceeded along predictable volatility curves. He had, unconsciously, only ever dated women whose behavior he could model. Adaze was, from the first 30 seconds, entirely unmodelable. He spent the next 4 days constructing reasons to be in the lobby at 7:45 a.m. and 8:12 p.m. His ring noted that his stress indicators dropped during both windows. He categorized this as a calibration anomaly. When she finally stopped in front of him on a Thursday morning and said, "Are you timing your lobby appearances or is this a coincidence?" he told her it was data optimization. She laughed with her whole face and said that was the most Jaewon thing she'd ever heard from a man she'd only spoken to once, which told him she had been thinking about him at least enough to form a characterization, which his analytical brain lit up over for the entire duration of a 1-hour conference call. He asked her to dinner, and she said yes, and he spent 45 minutes researching restaurants before his assistant pointed out that he had never previously spent more than 8 minutes on this task, which he told his assistant was irrelevant, which his assistant clearly did not believe. But what he did not tell his assistant, what he did not tell anyone, was that he had called his 2 best friends the night before and been laughed at so thoroughly that he was still slightly humiliated about it. Park Sung-hyun, who had been his closest friend since freshman year of university and who traded equities 2 floors below him, picked up on the first ring. This was unusual. Sung-hyun never picked up on the first ring. He considered it a character flaw in other people to be so immediately available. "She's not a fitness tracker," Jaewon said, by way of opening. A beat of silence. "What?" I touched her waist and told her I thought her sensor had shifted, and she said those exact words, "That is not a fitness tracker." The laughter that followed lasted 45 seconds by Jaewon's count, and he counted because it gave him something to do while he waited for it to end. "You touched a stranger's waist," Sung-hyun said, when he had recovered to the point of basic sentence construction. "In a lobby because you thought she was a malfunctioning biometric device?" "I thought the sensor had shifted. I was trying to be helpful." "Jaewon," Sung-hyun's voice carried the tender disbelief of someone watching their most capable friend drown in a puddle. "Brother, when was the last time you spoke to a woman who wasn't a client or a vendor?" He considered this genuinely. "The receptionist on floor 12. She retired 8 months ago. I was at the party." On the other call, Kim Do-hyun, who ran a sports analytics startup and had been at every pivot point of Jaewon's adult life, including the orange hair incident, was somehow less merciful than Sung-hyun had been and considerably louder about it. "The beads," Do-hyun said, not as a question but as a declaration, like a man discovering a new continent of human failure. "She was wearing her grandmother's ancestral beads from Enugu, and you diagnosed them as a malfunctioning CGM sensor? I didn't know what they were. You could have said nothing. You could have pressed the lobby button and looked at your phone like a normal person in the modern era. I was trying to be helpful. You were trying to optimize something that did not require optimization." Do-hyun paused. "Was she beautiful? That's not relevant data. The fact that you called me at 11:30 p.m. means it's the most relevant data there is." Both of them told him to take her somewhere with actual food and not to bring his laptop or quote anything from the Wall Street Journal, 2 prohibitions that told him they knew him entirely too well. Dinner was the second great disruption. She talked about her grandmother with the easy reverence of someone who carried their ancestors close to the surface. She talked about the market in Enugu and the particular quality of harmattan dust and what it felt like to move through a city where everyone she passed carried some thread of her own story. She talked about the loneliness of soul in the first months, the specific homesickness that lives in sensory detail, the way she had found her grandmother's spirit in a particular street food cart in Mapogu that made a pepper stew that came close enough to cry over. Jaewon had lived in Seoul for 31 years and had never once described it as a city with a particular quality. He had described it, when asked, in terms of market access, real estate appreciation, and transport infrastructure. He sat across from this woman and felt for the first time that he had been living inside a data visualization of a city rather than the city itself. "You're doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" "Analyzing. I can see it. You get very still and your eyes go slightly somewhere else." He had never been observed that precisely before. "What do I look like when I'm not analyzing?" She tilted her head and considered him seriously. I haven't seen it yet. I'm looking forward to it. His ring recorded a heart rate of 94 that had no business existing in a resting state. The beads came up again on the third date because he was constitutionally incapable of leaving unresolved data alone. She was wearing a different strand that night, finer beads in deep burgundy and gold that he could see clearly now at the hem of her blouse, and he asked if each strand was different. She explained the system to him slowly and without condescension, which he appreciated because he had the feeling she was used to explaining things to people who asked with less genuine curiosity than he was bringing. Each color carried meaning that was layered and personal, and also communal, an inheritance of feminine knowledge that moved from hands to waist across generations. The beads read against the body and changed in meaning as the body changed. They were, she said, a language worn privately. Jaewon, who had built his entire professional life on the idea that the only reliable language was quantitative, sat very still with this information. Can I ask what the ones tonight mean? She looked at him across the table with those satellite calibrating eyes. The burgundy is for strength during transition. The gold is my grandmother's color. She always said gold was for women who intended to be remembered. A small smile. I put these on when I have a feeling about something, when I want to arrive somewhere protected. Protected from what? From things that don't deserve all of me. He processed this for several seconds. Is tonight a night you needed protection? She said, I thought I might. I'm revising that assessment. He had never been revised upward before. He found it to feel, in biometric terms, like standing in direct sunlight after a long indoor season. The first time he touched her face was an accident that was not an accident. They were in his apartment, which she had walked into and immediately characterized as a place where a man lived who had been told what an apartment should contain and had acquired those things without further inquiry. She was not wrong. He watched her move through his space with the specific alertness of someone reading a room for what was missing rather than what was there. And she stopped in front of his kitchen shelf where he kept a single piece of decor, a framed print of a Fibonacci spiral, and she tilted her head at it for so long that he came to stand beside her. What are you thinking? He asked. That you put mathematics on your wall because you find it beautiful, she said, which means somewhere inside all the data there is a person who understands that some things are worth seeing. He turned to look at her, and she turned at the same moment, and they were closer than the room required. He reached up and touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with the careful precision of someone who understood they were handling something that had no replacement value. And she went very still, her eyes on his, and the silence between them had more information in it than any trading floor he had ever stood on. Jaewon, she said quietly. I know, he said. Do you? I'm learning. She laughed, soft and low, and he felt it in his sternum. He was close enough now that he could see the fine gold of her earrings catching the light, close enough to smell the warm and particular scent of her skin, and he brought his forehead down slowly to rest against hers, with the deliberateness of a man making a decision he understood the weight of. They stood like that for a long moment, their breath evening out between them, his hands cradling her face with a gentleness his ring probably had no metric for. When she finally kissed him first, it was brief and decisive, the kiss of a woman who knows what she is choosing, and he responded with the same quality of decision, his arms coming around her with the quiet certainty of someone who has stopped calculating and started arriving. Sunghyun and Dohyun met her on a Saturday, which Jaewon had agreed to under the condition that they behave like functional adults, a condition neither of them met within the first 4 minutes. Sunghyun shook her hand with slightly more formality than the situation called for, which was his version of nerves, and said, He called me at 11:30 p.m. because of the beads. I want you to know that. I know, Adiaze said. He told me. Sunghyun turned to look at Jaewon with an expression of pure and delighted betrayal. Dohyun was worse. Dohyun pulled out his phone and showed her a screenshot of a group chat message Jaewon had sent at 11:52 p.m. the night of the lobby encounter that read in its entirety, I told a woman her ancestral beads were a malfunctioning CGM sensor. Heart rate elevated, no physiological explanation, provide analysis. To which Do-hyun had responded, I cannot help you. You are a lost cause. Also, what did she look like? Adiaze read this and laughed until she had to put her hand on the table for support. Jae-won watched his two closest friends fall comprehensively under her spell within the first 20 minutes, which he should have predicted and hadn't, because there was no model for what it looked like when Adiaze Okafor decided to be warm at someone. Sung-hyun, who had not discussed anything unrelated to market structure and football in approximately 5 years, spent 40 minutes talking to her about the literature he had read in university and abandoned when he discovered derivatives. Do-hyun, who was famously unsentimental about everything except his team's win-loss ratio, listened to her describe her grandmother's bead stringing practice with an attention that Jae-won had previously seen him give to fourth-quarter analytics. On the walk back to the subway, Do-hyun pulled Jae-won 2 steps behind and said very quietly, "Don't ruin this." "I'm aware. I mean specifically, don't optimize it. Don't try to establish predictive models for her behavior. Don't set calendar reminders to be romantic. Just be in the room with her." Jae-won looked at his friend for a moment and said, "When did you become wise?" "I've always been wise. You just had too many notifications enabled to hear me." The period that followed restructured him in ways he could neither predict nor prevent. He started noticing things he had previously filtered as non-actionable data, the way different neighborhoods in Seoul smelled in different weather, the particular sound of the city at 6 a.m. before it decided to be itself. His assistant noted that he had stopped eating lunch at his desk, that he was leaving the office by 7:30, and that he had not once in 11 years taken a long weekend, and he had now taken 2 in 6 weeks. His assistant said nothing about any of this, but developed an expression of quiet vindication that Jae-won chose not to interrogate. He brought her flowers once, and she told him that cut flowers were a strange custom, severing something alive from its roots so you could watch it die decoratively on someone's counter. He had never thought about it that way, and now could not unthink it. He brought potted things after that, things with root systems, things that could be kept. She placed them on her windowsill and called them their garden. They developed a rhythm that felt lived in before it should have, the comfortable overlapping of 2 lives finding their natural orbits. He would spend Sunday mornings in his apartment reading while he ran, and he would come back to find her cross-legged on his couch with a book she had brought from her shelf because she didn't trust his, and she would look up at him with the warm, unhurried attention of someone who was not tracking time, and he would feel the day open up like something vast and possible. He learned to make jollof rice under her supervision and got it wrong twice and right the 3rd time, and she ate 2 bowls and called her mother to report this as a minor miracle. He sat beside her during that call and listened to her mother laugh and felt profoundly and with some disorientation that he was inside something that had already decided to become permanent. On evenings she stayed late, they would sit on his balcony with the city stretched out below them, her head on his shoulder and his arm around her, and she would tell him things about her childhood in slow installments, the kind of telling that only happens when trust has been accumulated rather than requested. Her father teaching her to drive in an empty car parking on a Sunday, her mother reading Achebe aloud during power outages, the whole family gathered around a single candle, the way her grandmother hummed while she worked, old songs that had no official title, just rhythms that had come down through the women of their family like an inheritance too large to document. He listened to all of it with the absolute attention of a man who has discovered that the most important data set he has ever encountered cannot be queried, only received. He told her things too, slowly, in his own way, in the language of facts surrounding the feeling, rather than the feeling itself. That his father had been a mathematician who wanted him to be something less solitary than a mathematician, that he had chosen finance because it was the one place his particular way of seeing was considered an asset rather than a limitation, that Sung-hyun had been the first person in his adult life who had learned to translate him, to hear the affection inside the analysis, and that Do-hyun had followed not long after, and that now there were only those 3. "And now me," she said. "And now you," he agreed. She turned on his shoulder to look up at him. "I see you," she said, which was such a simple arrangement of words to carry so much. He kissed her forehead with a care that he understood, even in the moment, was not a small thing coming from him. "I know you see me," he said. "It's the most extraordinary thing that's ever happened to me." The intimacy between them grew in the way of things given proper conditions, steadily and without announcement. There was an evening in her apartment when they had been cooking together, her teaching him the particular rhythm of how to layer spice, and the kitchen had gone warm and close with steam from the pot and music from her phone, and she turned from the stove and found him watching her with an expression she had not seen him use before, open in a way his face rarely was, all the analysis suspended, just presence. She crossed the small kitchen and kissed him, and he pulled her in with a certainty that was new, his hands at her waist where the beads sat beneath her dress, his fingers brushing them through the fabric, careful and deliberate. She laughed into his mouth at that, and he laughed too, and it was the best kiss they had ever had, for reasons that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with being known. He met her friends, too. Chiamaka, who had been her best friend since secondary school in Enugu, and who now worked in international finance 2 cities over, and video called every Sunday with the punctuality of a standing board meeting. Adeza propped the phone on the counter during one of their Sunday mornings, and Chiamaka examined Jaewon with the focused energy of someone conducting due diligence on a significant investment. "You're the censor man," Chiamaka said. "I am," Jaewon said. "Good that you know it. She's my person, you understand? Whatever you do with that information is between you and your God." She paused. "Or your ring, I suppose, in your case." He told Chiamaka she was right about the ring, and Chiamaka laughed and said she liked him, which Adeza later told him was not easily extracted and should be treated as a significant signal. He told Do-hyun and Sung-hyun about the Chiamaka call that same evening, and they received this information with the solemn satisfaction of men who had been waiting for their friend to have something real for a very long time. "How's your HRV?" Sung-hyun asked. "Optimal," Jaewon said. "Funny how that works," Do-hyun said. Then came October, and the thing that nearly destroyed everything. It began as a discrepancy. Jaewon was not a man who missed discrepancies. It was, in a very real sense, the entire skill set that his professional life was built on. And so when he noticed on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before the moment at the Han River that would become his before and after, that a series of trades in his fund's emerging markets portfolio had been structured in a way that bore a striking semblance to the front-running pattern he had spent 2 years identifying and reporting on in the markets of another fund entirely, he did not dismiss it. He stayed late. He stayed very late. He pulled the transaction records and the timestamp architecture and the order routing, and by 2 a.m. he had assembled something that looked like a picture he did not want to be looking at. The trades were linked to an account associated with a shell entity. The shell entity had a registered agent in the Cayman Islands. The registered agent's address appeared, when cross-referenced against documents he should not have been able to access, but could because Sung-hyun had sent him a file months ago that he had not fully examined, in the paperwork of a consultancy operating in Seoul. A consultancy on the 23rd floor of Gangnam Tower. He sat in his empty office at 2:17 a.m. and looked at this connection for a long time. His ring logged a resting heart rate of 101. He did not notice. He called Do-hyun, who picked up on the third ring with the voice of a man who had been asleep for 2 hours and was immediately and completely alert, because that was who Do-hyun was in a crisis. "Talk," Do-hyun said. Jaewon talked. He laid out the architecture of what he had found with the same precision he applied to everything. No editorial additions, no emotional coloring, just the structure of the data. When he finished, Do-hyun was silent for 5 full seconds. "You need to be certain," Do-hyun said finally. "I'm looking at it. You need to be more than looking. You need to be absolutely certain before you take another step." His voice was careful. "Because if you're wrong, you have just built a case against the woman you are in love with based on a shell company and a coincidence of addresses." "I'm not..." Jaewon stopped. Yes, you are, Do-hyun said, not unkindly. We've been watching it happen for 2 months, so be certain, not analyst certain, certain, certain. And if you can't get there, you call Sung-hyun. He called Sung-hyun at 2:34 a.m. Sung-hyun picked up immediately. Sung-hyun pulled up the regulatory filings database he had access to through his compliance role, and they went through the shell entity's history together, Jae-won at his desk, and Sung-hyun presumably in bed because he never specified. It took 90 minutes. At 4:06 a.m., Sung-hyun said, Jae-won, the consultancy on the 23rd floor has 19 registered tenants. The registered agent's address is linked to a logistics company, not your woman's firm. These are two different entities that share a building. Jae-won looked at the document trail again with this correction applied. The architecture shifted. The picture reformed into something different, something that pointed not at Adeza's floor, but at an entirely different operation on the 14th, a freight forwarding company that his own compliance team had flagged 3 months ago for unrelated reasons, and which is currently under investigation by the FSC. He had built a case against the wrong tenant. He sat with this for a long time. You didn't tell her, Sung-hyun said. No. Good. You were rigorous and you were wrong and no one was harmed by it. A pause. How are you? Jae-won looked at his ring, heart rate finally settling, HRV beginning its recovery. I have never been afraid of data before, he said. You weren't afraid of the data. You were afraid of what it would mean. That's different. That's human. Another pause. Go home. Sleep. Take her to that river path she likes tomorrow. He called Do-hyun to close the loop. Do-hyun said simply, Good. Now delete whatever you were building and don't tell her you built it. Should I not tell her? Would you want to know? Do-hyun asked. That someone you love spent a night arranging evidence against you and got it wrong? Or would you want to know that they caught themselves, verified, and then showed up the next morning ready to be present? He thought about this. You're wiser than I give you credit for, Jae-won said. I've always been wiser than you give me credit for. You're just finally operating on a frequency where you can hear it. He did not tell her. What he did instead was show up at her door with a potted bird of paradise, which she accepted with the slightly suspicious warmth of a woman who can sense that something has shifted, but cannot locate its source. And he took her to the Han River path that had become one of their places, and walked beside him with the particular quality of presence that comes from a close call with one's own worst assumptions. She knew something had happened. She was too perceptive not to. At one point, she stopped walking and turned to look at him and said, Are you all right? Yes, he said. And then, because she deserved more than his calibrated answer, I had a difficult few days at work. I think I mistook a shadow for something it wasn't. I'm recalibrating. She studied him. You solve everything by recalibrating. It's what I know how to do. What if something doesn't need a solution? What if it just needs you to sit with it? He looked at her for a long moment. The city moved around them. A jogger passed. A heron stood at the water's edge, doing nothing in particular with great serenity. I'm learning that, he said. She took his hand. Just that, the way she always did. The moment that became the point of reference, the before and after, happened on a Saturday in October when they were walking along the Han River and his ring buzzed with an investment alert that under any previous circumstances would have had him on his phone within seconds. His fund, a significant position moving against his model. He felt the buzz. He looked at the notification banner on his watch face, the red indicator, the percentage. He looked at Ariaze, who was pointing at something in the water and laughing at herself for pointing, and he silenced the notification. She turned and caught him watching her. What? Nothing, he said, telling my watch it doesn't have my attention right now. She studied him with that precise, gentle attention she gave everything. Was it important? Yes, he said honestly. It was just less important than this. She took his hand. Just that. No ceremony, the way you take the hand of someone you have decided to trust with the complicated, unquantifiable data of yourself. His ring logged a heart rate that was technically elevated by every clinical standard, and was, he had finally admitted to himself, and his biometrics, and all the expensive software that tracked them, the healthiest reading he had produced in 11 years. He met her mother on a video call, a woman in Lagos with her daughter's eyes, and a directness that made his own mother seem oblique. She asked him what his intentions were. He said he intended to keep learning. Her mother considered this and said it was the first honest answer she had ever received from a man who had clearly prepared dishonest ones. He had not prepared dishonest ones, which meant she had read him entirely correctly, which he found simultaneously humbling and strangely comforting. That Sunday, in his apartment, in the late afternoon light that came through the windows at the precise angle that turned everything gold, he was sitting on the floor against the couch with her legs stretched across his lap and a book open on her chest, and the potted things she had arranged on his windowsill casting small shadows onto the wall, and he thought, "This is what the ring has been trying to measure and cannot, this specific weight, this specific quality of silence. The way she breathes when she's reading something that matters. The way she still wears the beads on Sundays, even at rest, because they are not a thing she takes off for comfort. They are the language her grandmother wrote for her before she left, and she carries them into every room she enters, including his." He reached over and touched the beads through her dress, just briefly, just to say something that neither of them needed to put into words. She looked up from her book. He looked back at her. "What?" he said. "Nothing. Everything." She went back to her book, but she was smiling, and the smile stayed. Some things resist every framework that tries to contain them. Some things can only be known the way beads know a body, by touch, by inheritance, by the specific gravity of being held. He was a slow learner by the standards of people who didn't have to unlearn so much first, but he was, finally, learning the right things. Sung-hyun texted him that evening, "How's the HRV?" He looked at his ring. Optimal. Actually optimal, not the performed optimum of disciplined sleep and controlled diet, but the real kind, the kind that comes from a nervous system that has, at last, found something worth settling for. "Best reading in 11 years, he sent back. Do-yeon, who was inexplicably in the thread, replied, "Told you, delete the notifications, be in the room." And Jaewon looked up from his phone at the woman reading across his apartment, in his space that she was, slowly, without anyone's explicit permission, making into a home, and thought that for a man who had built a career on information, he had never been in possession of a more important signal. He set the phone down. He did not pick it up again until morning. Hi besties, my audiobook is out. If you want interesting, uncensored, and spicy, link in bio. Link in the description for both books. If this found you at the right time, subscribe. The next story is already waiting. Drop a comment telling me which line you're still thinking about. I read every single one.